Hello everyone, my name is Sean.
Hi, Sean.
I am a senior associate. I work with Elsa, and one of my specialties is doing corporate transactions. So helping our clients know what kind of entity is best for their film and how to really get their basic equity financing done. So these are going to be the questions that we're going to hit in the next 15 minutes. But all of you have in your packets a couple pages. They should be towards the front, starting with our interview sheet. So, what is the purpose of forming an LLC for a film? There are many reasons, but number one, you want to be able to shield your liability as a producer in the event that something catastrophic goes wrong, there's a claim against the film, let's say the crew didn't get paid, someone gets injured on set, that's not your fault, but they still have to make an insurance claim. An LLC is a limited liability company. It's shielding you, unless you do something drastically wrong within the LLC, from being personally liable for any lawsuit against you. At its very basic level. So that's one reason that you would want to form an entity for your film. The second one, which we're going to be talking about now, is equity financing. Equity financing is basically where you're going to, and Elsa's going to get into this in a little bit, as the who, what, where, when, and why of equity financing. But you are essentially taking an investment, and with that investment, you are giving your investor back a piece of that LLC, an ownership stake, most of the time, of that LLC as a non-managing member that they're going to own. And at the end of the day, that LLC is going to own one thing, and that's the copyright to the finished film. So that person is essentially getting an ownership stake of a piece of your film in exchange for X amount of dollars. So, with equity financing, we have to form our entity. 95% of the time, we're going to be forming an LLC as opposed to a corporation. And that's just, it will take another 20 minutes to get into, but at the base level, it's a lot easier to be selling pieces of your LLC than to be selling shares of your corporation. There's a lot more kind of things that you have to follow with the SEC and regulations you have to follow with the corporation. So most people are doing an LLC. Now, one of the first questions I always get is, where should I form my LLC? Because you have to form your LLC in every state that you work in. I know people will ask, where should I form it? I'm here in California, my producing partner is in New York, and we're thinking about shooting in Louisiana. Which is the best state that I form? And our typical answer is, it depends, right? You're gonna hear that a lot today. It depends. So, for the most part, most people will form their LLC in the state that they're actually shooting. For a number of reasons, but the first one is if you're shooting in a state that has tax incentives, a lot of those states require that the entity receiving those tax incentives is actually formed within that state. The second reason why is, let's use that example again. If you're in California, you're thinking about forming your LLC in California because it's nice and easy and you live here and you're shooting in Louisiana. If you're doing a lot of contracts in Louisiana, Louisiana might still make you form an LLC there too. So it doesn't really help that you have an LLC in California. You'd have to still register the LLC in Louisiana. Okay? Great. So, that's what type of entity should I form? What state should I form in? What information do I need? Now again, this varies from state to state because every state has different regulations and information that they require. But for the most part, they need one, a name of an LLC. Now, I used to do litigation before this, and let me tell you, the number of people that would come to me and say, I want to sue this person, and their LLC was like, getting buck wild on a Friday night LLC was out of bounds, okay? And you don't want to be going to court with that, with a judge reading out your LLC name. Okay? So, most people will form it as like, Buck Wild the Movie LLC. Or something a little more innocuous. It also tells people what, your LLC is actually forming, what you're actually doing with your LLC. Just a little hint there, so. If your movie title is a little outrageous, think about that as well. So, information, name. Second, you will typically need an address in the state that you're forming it. Okay? So let's use that example again. We're in Louisiana. We don't live in Louisiana. The only reason we're there is we're shooting. Some people have their line producer there. Some people have a production office there that they'll use as their address. Other than that, some people have no connection with that state other than, hey, we're getting a tax incentive, and we're going to go down to Louisiana and shoot. So there are third-party vendors that will allow you to use their address. in exchange for like $100 a year. And they're called a corporate vendor. If you ever hear stories about like, these 10,000 companies are all registered to the same address in Delaware, it's a corporate vendor that all these people are paying $100 a year to use that address. Right? The next thing, and one of the more important things, is we need to know who are the managers of the LLC. Okay? Typically, those are going to be the producers of the project. Now, the managers of the LLC manage the day-to-day operations of the LLC. They make all the business and creative decisions on behalf of the LLC. Now, so unless there's a producer contract or some other contracts that give someone else some more approvals, that LLC document is going to govern who controls what in the LLC. A lot of times you'll see, like, let's say that there are 3 producers and all 3 of you are going to be managers. At the onset of when we're forming, we want to sit down and be totally honest with our other partners and say, okay, in the event of a disagreement, how are we going to handle that disagreement? Who's going to have control if we have issues with cuts? Who's going to be the ultimate deal, like tiebreaker, if we have an even number of managers? Who's going to have business controls? Is everyone going to be able to sign checks, or is just one manager going to be responsible for setting up the bank account and handling all payments? All these things need to kind of be sat down and discussed with your partners, the other managers of the LLC, when you're first forming the LLC. It's a lot easier to deal with it now when you're all happy and together and sitting in the same room than once an issue arises 6 months away when you're in the middle of production, right? And at least at that point, you're able to point to your operating agreement, which we'll get to in a minute, and say, okay, we'd all sat down and decided at the onset that this is how we were going to handle those issues. Okay? So managers. With that information, we're typically able to file our LLC. There are a couple other smaller things that we need, but that's the main ideas that we need to get across in order for, whether it's us, whether it's a corporate vendor, whether it's another firm, to form an LLC for you guys. After it's formed, what we then have, if you guys flip, so that interview sheet, basically, by the way, it's just the information that we typically look for when we're forming an LLC. So other things for you to consider, just smaller things than what we just discussed. What we have next is kind of just the initial documents that are actually filed with the state of California, just so that you have an idea of what is public information. This comes up every once in a while, especially when you're looking at the second document called the Statement of Information. Sometimes you'll have a bigger person that's a producer, whether it's like an A or B list star or someone, and they don't realize that, hey, like, let's just put my home address, like on the operating agreement, that's where I'll register as my address, and they don't realize that some of these documents are public and searchable. That's just something to be aware of. I always caution people, like, hey, this is publicly searchable in the state database, you might not want to put your home address. The next thing we have is what we call our short form operating agreement. Now, just as a disclaimer, if we're seeking equity financing, this isn't nearly enough information that we're going to need. Okay? It's meant to give you kind of a base level of, here is what I should be considering when I'm forming my LLC. It's not meant to take the place of a private placement memorandum, which is basically an offering to solicit equity financing. It's just meant to give you a very base level of what a document that lays out all the rules and regulations of the LLC. So an operating agreement is basically, if you think about the US, an operating agreement is your constitution. Okay? It's what everyone looks back on, and this is the rules that the LLC is formed by. And at the end, you'll see every manager signs it, and whenever there's a dispute, whenever there's an issue, these are the rules that the LLC is to be governed by. Okay? So you'll see, like, there's a lot of information, like who's handling tax returns, who are the managers. There's a paragraph about the managers, and they'll tell you, okay, in the event of a disagreement, we either use a majority vote, or we have, Michael is in charge, he has the tiebreaker for creative decisions, and Jill has the tiebreaker for business decisions. That's all going to be laid out here. Like we talked about, it's going to be very important to lay those out at the early onset, because if there are issues rising later, it's a lot easier to point to somewhere and be like, this is what we had already decided upon, than to be fighting about it on set. Right? Okay. If we keep going, so you'll see that the operating agreement goes for a couple pages, just meant to give you a brief overview. The next thing, and the final thing in my packet, is a waterfall. A waterfall is basically the definition for once your film is being exploited, any dollar that comes out from the exploitation of that film and is paid to the LLC, how are those dollars distributed? Okay? You'll see that this one is a standard one, but it goes through a lot of different levels of here's where my dollars have to hit before I, as a producer with all my back-end points, get to be recouping, or with my deferment, where I get to be making my money back.
Is this the term sheet you're talking about?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, it says net proceeds definition. It should be just before the term sheet. I don't know if there are page numbers on there. We'll get into the term sheet in a second. But, so we call it the waterfall because each level of those sub-paragraphs has to be hit and fully filled out before monies get to flow into the next level underneath them. So some of those things might be applicable, might not be applicable to your thing, like collection account fees. Does anyone here with their film, just show of hands, have a CAM that they had to set up? A couple of you? Okay. It's called a collection account management agreement, which is the main agreement that basically governs how your monies are meant to be distributed from around the world. So basically there are like two banks in the Netherlands called Freeway and Vintage, if those names ring a bell. And basically if your film's being exploited all over the world, there are monies flowing in from all over the world, different denominations, different currencies. Basically they all, if you pay a company money, again, everyone wants money, you pay a company money, all the monies go to them, they convert it into US or Euro, or whatever you want, and then distribute this money according to the waterfall on your behalf, so that you as the producer never have to think about percentages or residuals or having to answer to your investors ever again. But they charge a fee for that, right? So they're always, and because they make the agreement, they always get to be first. The second one, since I saw a lot of people raise their hands about having already done their film, if you had residuals, as you know, NPLs are going to have the residuals at the very top of your waterfall as well, from any dollars that flow in, from the very first dollars. Next, you'll see like distribution costs and sales agency costs. If you have a distributor on your film or a sales agent, again, they're going to negotiate with you to have their fees very high up in your waterfall from any gross receipts that come in. And then we start to get into our investors, which Elsa will touch on in a minute with our equity term sheet, and how our investors are meant to be repaid. What their percentage back is, we call that a premium for equity investment, how they're actually receiving their money. After that, we might have our producer deferments because we, as producers, wanted to make sure that our film is the best quality, and we deferred all of our fee except for our living expenses, right? And now we need to know when are we actually getting repaid, typically after investors. Okay. After that, we have basically any monies that are left. We have net profits. We've heard of back-end points. So our net profits are basically broken down into 50-50 for most of the time for equity investors. 50% is going to go to you, the managers or producers, and that's what you're going to retain, or you're going to give out as third-party participation. So if you are allocating back-end to crew, or cast, or writers, or the director, those are going to come out of your half. It's called the producer's share of net profits. Anything left over is typically retained by the producers or managers of the project. So people are sometimes cautious, sometimes people use a lot of those to entice people to come onto their project in lieu of higher fixed compensation. The other 50% is called the investor's share, and that is what is allocated to any equity investors that come onto the project. So if your project is 100% equity raised, and let's say your budget's $1 million, and you raised $1 million in equity investment, which is fantastic, unusual but fantastic, you're going to basically allocate all that investor share, that 50% of the back end, to your investor. So let's say you had one investor come in, and he put up half of that budget in equity. So you put in $500,000. He's getting half of that 50% of the investor's share. If someone, and then as you go down, like someone put in $10,000, like your mom loved the project, she put in $10,000, it was from her IRA, right? She puts that in, okay? She's gonna get 1% of that investor's share. So basically it's on a pro rata basis based on one, what the entire equity raise was, divided by what your investor actually put in.
Can you say that last thing one more time, that last thing you just said?
Oh, it's on a pro rata basis. You're basically going to take that investor's share, that 50% of the back end, and it's going to be allocated. One, you're going to take the total amount of your equity raise You're gonna divide it by, it can be the total amount of equity raised or your budget. Sometimes people do debt mixed with equity, and it just depends on how the producers want to do it, that's a little complicated. So we'll just say 100% of your equity raised, divide by what that person actually invested. And that's where you wind up with their pro rata share of the investor's share of net profits.
Which you multiply by 50%. Like if you're doing it as an equation, because it's half of the total.
Yeah.
So I see, like 10 firsts here. Is that, so say you got your first $100. Is that
Yes.
like $100 goes to A or 10 divided by?
It would go to A, most likely.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
no,
then it would go to B. and then it
yes,
would go to C.
you can do it either way. We just like to, basically, it looks better when you're going out to investor when they're listed as number 3 instead of number 8 there, just for visuals. But all of those levels have to be hit before money's flow down into
No, I'm
those.
saying like on the first, you got like 10 firsts.
Yeah, so in this situation,
Like
your,
$100. Where would it go?
your collection account would take that because their fee's more than $100.
But some of these things are percentages, right? So let's call it $100,000. Just to run through like standard percentages, right? So you're like, okay, how does this go? So collection account is 1%. So 1% of that. Residuals, let's say it's just SAG, let's call it 3.6%, which they set aside, they reconcile, and they pay out. So now you're at 4.6% of the $100,000, right? Bonuses, whatever, let's call that a finite.
Okay, so it's percentage based.
Some of it's percentages, some of it's flat, and you literally, like, there's a level of detail of the percentages that will get fleshed out with the collection account management agreement or in your docs.
Okay, so the first could actually be paid off. The first could actually.
Like the percentage, some of these things are percentage, so like residuals, collection account, sales agent, producer rep maybe, are sometimes distribution legal are percentages. So every dollar that comes in, they're getting a cut, and that can be ongoing. And then costs are fixed, and so they may or may not get paid depending on where they are.
Got it.
Yeah.
And so also when you're taking this out to investors, again, if we recall, this is going to be before we actually produce our film. So we might not know who our distributor is or what that percentage might be at this point. So we have to be a bit more broad in our waterfall, saying like, okay, distribution fees and costs are going to be included, on that deed. But we just don't know what those are yet because we don't have our distributor. We know that we're going to have to eventually pay them at this level, but we don't know exactly what their fees and costs are going to be. Yeah.
You might be getting into this, so stop me if
Okay.
you want to do it later, but I just found out unit versus more traditional financing. Is this more the traditional financing, or is it?
I would say it's kind of your preference. Some people like units because it's easier to kind of pitch that to people. We're selling units of $25,000, not selling, but we're, your equity investment is offering for one unit of $25,000.
That's what we did, because also I heard that it protects you at the end when there's all this distribution costs and sell.
I actually, yes. I think that the problem with the unit versus pro rata is that pro rata allows for there to be fluctuation in what they're getting, right, in terms of the back end points that Sean just described. So in a fixed unit, you're basically putting yourself in a position where it's not subject to dilution. Now, some of my clients strategically do units because they don't want to do a pro rata share of 50%. It's a little bit of a smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
They say, here's a unit, you're getting 5%, but when you add up the units of the equity, it gets to 25 or 30, and they're able to sell that to the investor. Now, when we represent the investor, we're like, okay, where's the rest of the points going? We should get pro rata 50. So but also producers have made a mistake where they'll say, it's a unit, then you have a budget overage, and you raise more money, you don't have those points to give, you can't dilute. So you have to be careful. The unit is a little bit more fixed, you have to strategically know what you're getting yourself into. Pro rata allows for a little bit of flexibility. The one other thing too is like, Sean's waterfall is like the producer's vision of the waterfall. Right? Let's be real.
Yeah.
Like the financier is gonna be like, Sean, and we'll go into this in the closing, like just in terms of the rub between the financier and the producer. They'll be like, no collection account has ever been more than 1%, so cap. No sales agent should be getting more than 20%. It should be third party, it should be auditable, it should be, so there are this is like the line items we need, and then the financier's sophistication may insert more rules around this. They may say, I don't care that you deferred your fees, take out deferments, I want my back end. So that's the push and pull. But these are the things you have to think about before you give them up.
I think that's a good segue into.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sean. I do not have that luxury. I got a gas card from my dad when I started a law firm, and that was about his contribution. So, friends and family, I will say that like the parents and immediate family construct and the you construct is dangerous because it doesn't allow for there to be processes and procedures to really protect you. And on both sides, right? Like it's easier to spend your mom's money than Bob's money in Texas who's gonna sue you. So that doesn't mean you should get rid of the discipline and sort of like the nature of the formality of setting up a limited liability company, making sure that, you know, the line producer that you're having a budget enters into an agreement. You have to still treat it like a business for a couple of reasons. One is, when you're in that intimate like family or your own money, you can be sloppy because you're fast and loose and it's like you're reporting to yourself, but you have to treat it like a business. A, you don't want to get sued or make stupid mistakes, but B, when Bob comes in to write said big check and you don't have your chain of title done and your mom spent $100,000 because she let you fly first class for location scout, Bob is not going to write a check to pay that back, and it's going to put you in a bad position. So you have to kind of be disciplined about whoever the profile of your investor is to treat it still like a business, right? And to treat it and discipline it in a way that makes sense. The other problem is when it's you have to be really careful about who you're surrounding yourself with so that you're running a business, right? Like, if you're the director and it's your money, you better have a line producer that has your back and is going to keep you on budget and on schedule because you cannot do everything, right? And if it's your money and you're acting in it, you need to surround yourself with a team. You still have to treat yourself like an investor and surround yourself with a team that's going to get it done. So these are a lot of times where I've noticed, like, I can just see it in the initial consultation with the client that, like, they're going to be their own worst enemy, and I really try to pull them into the business of it, right? Like, I get that you're writing a check for $50,000 to go on a location scout. You guys don't even have the rest of the budget. Like, what is going? Like, you still have to make business decisions, right? Even if it's your money. And look, if you just want to go to Sundance and you have a lot of money, that's great. I suspect not everybody in this room has that luxury, so still treat it like a business. High net worth individuals. This is a funny one because, like, they're all in LA just ready to write a check, right? They're in Starbucks and they're like, you are writing a script, let me write you a check. It doesn't really happen, and yet, like, my life of 15 years in this business has been surrounded by said person. How do people get to said person? Well, there's a whole underbelly in this industry called finders, right? How many of you have dealt with a finder fee agreement or scenario? Okay. These are generally people that either have a lot of plastic surgery or really don't know what to laundry on, but for some reason are really good at finding money, right? Like, there's 3 or 4 that have been in my life for 15 years, and they're like, they find said person. You have to be really careful about the fact, right? The person that says that they can find you money, you need to do their due diligence. You need to do your due diligence, make sure they're legit and real, and yes.
What does it go finder's fee percentage?
Well, the typical finder fee percentage is 5%, right? And the problem is that the producer very easily gives 5% in the construct of an agreement, and then when you're trying to make a movie for $500,000, that 5%, you don't factor the 5% into your budget, and it's like the age-old dilemma. I think that you also need to make a distinction between, and this is so gross and happens all the time, like 5% of equity, like if you get Bob from Texas to write a check, maybe you're entitled to 5%. But if you introduce me to 3 Point Capital to lend against my tax credits, why on earth would I pay 5% for that? And that's a big mistake that producers make, is that you need to be really clear about the relationship with your finder. I am putting you, schmoozy guy named Jeff, we know said guy, to find me equity financing. You're non-exclusive, you have to get my prior written approval, and yeah, when you find me said equity financier, I'll give you 5% when I irrevocably receive it. Schmoozy Jeff will say, I get 5% of whatever you get, I'm exclusive, I'm gonna get a producer, I'm gonna get 10% if I feel like it. Like you have to be really careful about that. And you do need to make the distinction between debt and equity, because as we'll talk about today, equity is risk, right? Like you kind of need to identify such people. There's other networks of finding high net worth individuals. You know, as you guys may be aware, CAA, Endeavor Content, sometimes other agencies like Gershon UTA, and ICM also, they do have a Rolodex of high net worth individuals. Why would they help you? They're only gonna help you when your package involves their talent, right? So like, your female director just got signed with UTA, Beck Smith may call you and say, let's talk about your film. And they may introduce you to that. They're also gonna want a package fee. On top of the package fee, they're also gonna want a sales fee, right? So you're basically agreeing to get in bed with them in more ways than one. They're going to, yeah.
What would that package be, like 2.5, or do they ask for more sometimes?
It's negotiable, and it's also the rub against what's equity and what's not. It's also, and I will say that if you're living in that under 2 million equity world, agencies are not gonna be cost prohibitive to that, right? So like, they may say, it's a $1.25 million movie you're shooting in 30 days. It's insane for us to take 2.5%. We'll waive the package fee, but we're gonna get 10% of a sales fee, which is traditional, right? So that's where you need to like make sure early on you're having those discussions and you're thinking about it, right? Like all of these contingent back ends you're giving to finders and like other people, you have to also reconcile that with your line producer, and not like the week before when you're trying to close with your bond, they're like, who's Jeff, schmoozy guy, and why is he getting $100,000 that hasn't been budgeted anywhere, right? So like, you have to open up the lines of communication and know what you're getting yourself into. You also need to make sure that in these various deals, you know, they're a work for hire, they're not retaining any rights. Like there's a lot of stuff, again, I can't have you be a lawyer by the end of the day, but you can't be frivolous or casual about anyone that touches your asset, right? Like you have to think of the screenplay as an asset, and anyone that touches it, you need to make sure you have clean breaks with them. Because the last thing you want, and as we'll see on the closing call, is a litany of issues because you signed 10 bad short forms because your mom gave you 10 grand. You know what I mean? Like, there's also grants and nonprofit financiers, so there's a couple ways to skin that cat. One is there are fiscal sponsorship programs. This happens a lot more in doc space, but quite frankly, in feature film, I've seen it happen. Like I've had clients go through the Sundance Institute. Either Sundance does grants or they get grants through other programs. Generally speaking, these are non-recoupable, just pure contributions, but not always. It's not either of you, but we had a situation this week where my client made a $500,000 film, and like they didn't consult with an attorney, and they signed something that on the subject line said, grant, here's $50,000, da-da-da-da, and like on page 8, like 8J, okay, like after jurisdiction, which is so gross. It's like, by the way, we're getting 25% of your gross until we get our $50,000 back. So that defeats your entire waterfall, and that's an issue, right? So literally, the client's like, what should we do? I was like, you gotta go back with your tail between your legs to the financing, because they signed equity, they didn't tell us about the grant deal, like we're in delivery. I mean, fortunately, it's like not like a mind-blowing number, like it's something we can navigate around, but like we have to go back and fix it. And it's a problem. So again, like the frivolousness of signing things, you have to really think about it. And just because the word grant or fiscal sponsors in there is not the case. I have a client who's Silicon Valley based, who funds through his nonprofit, right? But he's an investor. It's just that the fund of like really good movies about vegan rights, Inc., well, that's a nonprofit, 501c3, will fund the film, but they expect to get the money back. They're just like any other investor. So you have to be careful about that word and where they fit into it, and is it recoupable, is it not? The other thing too is sometimes you'll get into equity financing where, like soft monies, where they'll also, like they'll say, oh, we're gonna give you this Belgium grant, but then they also take 5% of gross. So again, you need to look at the fine tune and make sure it fits into your overall construct. Oh, thanks. I don't want to follow you there. So she knows. Okay. Then there's financing production companies. So we just holler from about to strip. So as you guys know, there are champions of independent film that are sustainable production companies that finance independent film, right? Like Forrest Whitaker's company does it all the time. Black Bear had a movie. I just did 4 Good Days at Sundance with Mila Kunis and Glenn Close, and like that was a production company that has equity financing, kind of a construct. What? Indigenous, right. The issue with these companies is that they don't necessarily conform to your structure. And this is where it gets kind of complicated. In other words, you meet with Sean, your mom puts in 50 grand, you set up the LLC, blah, 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 blah. Well, the financing production company that can come in may say, that's all great, like I love that you set this up, but that's not how we roll. We want to do a co-production, or we want you to assign the rights to us and we want to take over it. So while a financing production company can be a great solution, you have to be a little bit clear about what their intentions are. So we had another movie that we worked on that there was a female-driven film fund that also deems themselves to be a production company. And they were, in that instance, willing to sign on to the operating agreement and sign an investor term sheet and kind of conformed into what Sean had set up. However, they had like a whole separate agreement that they wanted in relation to their approvals and controls. And so we had to reconcile that with moms and dads who had given money and sort of make sure that we were not sort of violating our promise to them that we were running it and managing it, and had to make disclosures that we were giving certain approval rights to Film Fund because they thought that they knew everything. So again, like that's a great resource. Generally, financing production companies come in when there are sort of like 2 types. One that come in when you have some equity and then they're validating, and then you have others that like kind of don't want to be bothered. Like they may say your mom can stay in and she'll get her money back, but I'm completely taking over. And so that's just something you have to be aware of. And then there's like, oh, thank you, okay, I'm on it, B. Then wherever else you can get money, you should take it. You just gotta comply with all the laws. So Sean did a really good job of showing it to you in context, but like what do investors get for their money, right? Again, we're talking about equity, we're talking about debt, and an hour. So they get a premium or a fixed return on their investment. Like the standard finder fee is 5%, the standard return on investment is 10 to 20%. Some investors think they're so cool and they'll ask for like 25%. Some are super nice and they'll ask for 5%. It's really a fluctuating thing, and it's a conversation, and really like these are the things that like your lawyer's not going to tell you. It's going to come up when you're at dinner with Bob and he's like, I want 110%. Like remember that, right? Like don't reintroduce the thought. Like that's what Bob said. Then they get a pro rata portion of 50%. So that's the model that we talked about with Sean. When do they not get that? Okay. One, if you have debt coming in where maybe your budget is $2.5 million and you only have $1 million of equity, maybe you don't give up 50% of your back end because 1.5% is debt, right? Maybe you get a $250,000 grant on $1 million budget. And this is something you have to think about early on. Your lawyer can't do this for you. And you have to say, okay, listen, there's a probability I'm going to get a grant. I want to be able to make the investor share 40%. Or 30%, or I want to give a pro rata share where the grant money that's not recoupable gets put back into the producer pool. But if you don't make those decisions and you just do like the boilerplate and you don't think about it, you just gave up 50 points when you didn't necessarily need to, right? Remember that the return on investment, the 110%, sits in where Sean showed in the waterfall. Sometimes investors think that that's right at the top. And you got to be really clear when you articulate what it is that your movie is about what it's going to take to monetize it. We're sad. We have residual obligations. UTA has come in, they brought in their director, they're selling it, they're taking a percentage. Like you need to be able to not like hide the ball and then for the first time introduce that there's off the top deduction. I'm not saying to be like kill the investment, but you have to be very forthright and explain the business model. We don't sell this movie at Sundance unless UTA sells it. We can't get SAG actors unless we pay residual. These are just facts, right? This is how the business is run. But if you can't stand by that and explain it, and you're just like, yeah, not deal with it, and I'm then dealing with their lawyer at Loeb, you're screwed. Because the lawyer at Loeb's gonna be like, I don't care, figure it out. Like she told us that it was gross, and that's what we want, and you guys need to figure it out. So that's where communication is really important before it gets to 2 lawyers sitting on the phone. Credits, you gotta be careful. Because your mom getting $10,000 gets an executive producer credit, then is every other investor getting it, and then you have like the grossest main titles ever. You may not care, I don't care, whatever. Like, you have to kind of be thoughtful about what credits you're giving up. You also need to be really careful about making that decision to call your investor a producer versus executive producer. The financing production companies, make no mistake about it, they're gonna expect to be a producer. And then you need to ask yourself, what does that mean? Is the sanctity of the operating agreement and approvals gonna change now because financing producer is gonna get final cut? And these issues do come up. So you need to be thoughtful about it. I also think like if you're doing a big raise with a lot of equity, sometimes it's just easier to make like hard and fast rules. If you finance 100,000 or less, you're gonna get a special thanks. If it's 100 to 500,000, you'll get a co-EP credit and title crawl. If you finance 25% or more of the budget, it's EP credits on a shared card with each other. Like, just make a rule and stick to it. And then why would you make the exception for your mom? Or like first early on, you say, look, they were the first investor, they're the exception to that, right? So like, again, thinking about it and not just like doing a pro forma where then you're delivering to Netflix and Netflix is like, you have 5 producer credits and 18 EP credits, all single card main titles with Steam, right? It happens. Okay, invitations, you gotta think of the vanity. Other fees in the budget are waterfall, so some equity may be like, look, I gotta pay my guy at Globe, you gotta factor in $10,000 in legal fees, you guys either need to put that in the budget or not. Are there finder fees around that? Do you need to make that disclosure? You need to think about that. And then approvals or consultation rights, right, that we talked about. And then kind of whatever they want. My daughter, Betty, wants to be in the movie, make sure her role is in there. Where the investment gets placed, I'm just going to gloss over this. 95% or more of the time, it's going to be a limited liability company. That's what Sean went into. But you may hear prospective investors say things like, well, it should be a limited partnership. Well, unless Bob's accountant has to make it that way, I prefer that you don't. You also need to have your own accountant that represents the limited liability company, that is telling you what the obligations and liabilities are for your taxes for the next however many years you have the LLC form. Because honestly, as the managers, you have control, but you also have the pain in the ass responsibility of filing taxes, right, until you dissolve the company. So you need to think about that and juxtapose that to Bob and what he wants. Yeah?
I'm just curious, from your perspective as your organization, how involved you say once somebody's post and dealing with an audit from any sort of financial partner?
Like how involved do I say?
Yeah, like do you guys end up protecting your clients at that point, or are you a deal-making law firm entirely, and you're off the books and their accountants deal with it, and if there's any sort of audit of any sort of process, they're going off of what's written and
Well,
there's no other work?
it depends where the audit's coming from. If it's a tax audit, it's honestly a tax thing. But sometimes SAG will audit, right? Either to get residuals or because something like they are like, you guys said you were ultra low and like everything in the media says you're 5 million, we're auditing this. So we deal with claims like that. Investor sends a letter from Loeb. You guys haven't been putting all the money through the CAM, we're suing you. Now listen, once it gets to litigation, we don't deal with that. But if there's sort of this like intermediary of like they're asking for stuff, can we provide it? Of course, we advise our client and try to figure it out. Okay, so LLC, you guys got the gist of that later. Okay. This is important because this is not about law. This is about understanding the intentions of why an investor is giving you money on the equity side, which is different than debt, okay? Let me just make sure I'm doing it. Okay. The point is that it's different than debt versus equity. Equity, the investor knows they probably are not going to get their money back. That is a truth that they know, right? And to the extent that they're delusional about that, you better be real careful and make sure your paperwork is real good, because they will pursue a claim or go crazy on you and ruin your life. So you have to be really careful about them coming to grips with the risk that is equity financing. Usually they're motivated by the team. So this is where it gets tricky, right? Like if they really believe in the director, but the director is not the manager and it's the producers, you could have a coup. Right? So you have to be careful about where what they view the team to be, and how you as the, I mean, now I'm speaking from the producer point of view. I know some of you guys are hyper, but when you're the producer and the investor is gravitating towards somebody else on the team that's a work for hire, you've got to make sure you're buttoned up in your paperwork. So if the investor gets, you know, allegiance with someone who doesn't have approval rights, how do you navigate that? Sometimes it's cause related. listen, sometimes it's just about wanting that Sundance movie. You have to be very clear that you maybe do not get into Sundance. But it's just believing that this woman should tell the story about Native American culture and she's awesome and like the investor just believes in it, right? And that's where you'll get like the financing, production companies, grants, etc. The endorsement from a financier for picking successful films, this is where you can really elevate your project, right? To be affiliated with a company that has had films at Sundance, you know, we represent Jamie Patrick Profit Hunting Lane, Sundial Pictures. These are people who have had a track record in financing independent films, where your affiliation to them really is just going to open up doors. It's going to help you sell the film. It's going to help you get into film festivals, and that kind of motivation is important. But you just got to know what they want and what you're giving up in exchange for that, because they're going to want more. This you have to go in with open eyes. Like, what is their real motivation? Okay, I had an investor a few years ago that I knew was an egomaniac and was out of control, and I warned my client to involve him in the publicity process. And when he showed up on the red carpet of the premiere and they cast him aside, and on the press release he wasn't mentioned, he lost it and engaged a litigator. He didn't really have any rights, but it was sort of like his ego and like his necessity of needing to be the most important person in the room caused him to spin out of control. And if, you know, Betty Sue is going to be in the movie and she's going to play a role, know what you're getting yourself into, right? Like, you're going to have to be polite and courteous to Betty Sue, who might be 17 and might not be that great of an actress, but like, that process has to be navigated in such a way. So it's really important for you when you do the thing with your equity investor to understand what their motivations are. And while some of it can be governed legally, right? So, look, Betty, we're going to give you this role in the movie. You're going to get paid SAG scale. She's not in SAG scale. It's Taft-Hartley. We didn't budget Taft-Hartley. You got to pay for that investor. She has to be available to come to San Diego. She has to come during this week. I can't guarantee that she'll be in the final cut because I have to make good business decisions for everybody else. And you got to make sure your lawyer's aware of that. The last thing you want is it's not governed in the investor agreement and she doesn't have a signed deal and she asks for $100,000 for the day. Like, can you imagine? It would be ridiculous. Or like Betty Sue is actually from China and doesn't have a visa. It's like, things like that happen to us all the time, and it's like, if you don't communicate with your lawyer and you don't set for that, it's gonna, and that's just one example, but you've really gotta make sure you know what their motivations are and you're planning for that. Okay, so that's the who, what, where, and why. We're going to take a 5 to 10 minute break and get more coffee. Yeah.